Okay, so Cortina captures Brownsville for a few hours when his lieutenant's lynched by the Texas Rangers, starts a 6-month war in the lower Rio Grande and all the way up to Corpus Christi and also into Mexico as well. A race war is what one of the U.S. Army officers calls it. By the way, the Mexicans, they could deal with the U.S. Army. They just hated the Texans, especially Anglo-Texans. Driven back into Mexico, he'll reappear during the Civil War. I mean, it's incredibly complicated. Cortina becomes a huge smuggler of Texas cattle, probably smuggles hundreds of thousands of cattle from ranches in South Texas. Very, very notorious after the Civil War. Ultimately, the Mexican dictator Porfirio Diaz captures Cortina, doesn't put him in jail, but puts him under house arrest. And Cortina dies in Mexico City in the 1880s, having proclaimed his Mexican citizenship. Interesting guy, very controversial to this day. Some folks see him as a Robin Hood character, defending the Mexican name in Texas against racism. Other folks see him as very, very cynical, just a thief who had just a small veneer of politics to justify his actions. But anyway, so that's Cortina. Now, let's move upriver to Laredo, which is a long way from Brownsville, 250 miles, something like that, 300 miles. It's a surprisingly long way. Now, the guy I'm going to talk about in Laredo is a guy by the name of Santos Benavides. And Santos Benavides is the anti-Juan Cortina, or you might say Juan Cortina is the anti-Santos Benavides. Let me bring up a picture of Santos. He's not in there. Hold on for a second. Sorry about that. Okay, you probably can't really see it that well. Anyway, Santos Benavides. What's his deal? He is just like Cortina in the sense that he comes from a very aristocratic border family. His great-grandfather, I think Tomas Sanchez, had actually founded Laredo in 1757. So he's very much a blue blood in Laredo, very much top of the social class. His uncle is a guy named Basilio Benavides. And so he's quite similar to Cortina. By the way, he never learns to speak English as well, like Cortina doesn't learn to speak English. Why would he? He's almost 30 when he becomes Texan and American. Okay, so after 1848, the Benavides family is extremely alarmed when Laredo becomes part of Texas. Remember, Texans had sacked Laredo. Remember, I talked about the Somerville expedition that morphed into the Meyer expedition. It started from San Antonio in 1842, and these folks came into Laredo and kind of tore up the town. And Benavides knew this. He wasn't stupid. It happened just 4 years ago. The other thing is Benavides knew that Tejanos had lost massive amounts of land after 1836. He knew that he anticipated that the same thing was going to happen in Laredo, and it does happen in Brownsville. But as it turns out, it doesn't happen in Laredo. You don't have the same kind of legalized land theft and intimidation in Laredo like you do in Brownsville. Partially that's because Brownsville, it appears in 1848. It's created in 1848. Laredo was an established community, really the most important established community on what became the Texas side of the Rio Grande River. The other thing is that the land around Laredo wasn't as valued by Anglos as the land near Brownsville because Laredo was so far from the Gulf of Mexico. So it really couldn't be a warehouse area. There was a lot of trade from Monterey to San Antonio via Laredo. But if you're from that area of Texas, I don't mean to insult you, but it's a pretty boring drive. I think we'd all have to admit, from San Antonio to Laredo. I guess it's got a certain kind of beauty, that South Texas area. The big industry was goats and sheep, uh, which is not nearly as romantic as cattle or horses. And the goats and sheep, some of that was for meat. Even in northern Mexico today, a cabrito is very much a delicacy, and there's many kinds. But also the leather and the wool, that's where really the money was. So the land wasn't really valued that highly, and so Anglos as a whole were not nearly as aggressive about going into Laredo and trying to, either by intimidation or by legal manipulation, capture land from these families. And in fact, there was a commission from the Texas government that was sent to Laredo. And the Texas government, the Texas state government, which was given the power to rule on whether or not land was owned by Tejanos or by Anglos, the Texas government decided pretty quickly after 1848 that it couldn't go to war with all the Tejanos on the border, that it would just be all these new Texans, right? It would just be total chaos, and you just don't want constant war. And so what the Texas government did was it recognized the land claims of the Spanish land claims. Remember, the Benavides family and the Cortina family, they had been given land by the Spanish government. Some cases the Mexican government, but most often the Spanish government. And this commission recognized the Spanish land claims of the Benavides family. Okay, you might be wondering, well, why didn't that happen in Brownsville? Well, technically it did happen in Brownsville, but what you had in Brownsville was this legal manipulation where individual members of families that controlled huge areas of land, these merchants convinced like an uncle or a cousin or whatever to sell portions of the family land, which you couldn't do under Mexican law, and then these sales were upheld by American courts. Let's go back to Laredo. You just didn't have that same drive in Laredo because, again, the land around Laredo was not considered that valuable. Long story short, Benavides and the Benavides family get to keep their land. They don't face the same kind of pressures as the Tejanos after 1836, and then the folks in Brownsville in after 1848. And this would be something that would be a good midterm question. What's the difference between Laredo Mexican Texans and Brownsville Mexican Texans? It really comes down to land. And once the Benavides family realizes, hey, I can't believe it, that the Texans are not going to hassle us. They're not going to come in and try to grab our land. And once they realized that, they thought, well, you know what, this isn't a bad deal. They were actually turned out to be happy that they were in Texas. It wasn't like being in Mexico was a picnic. Mexico was often chaotic. Laredo had attempted to leave Mexico in 1838. You'd had another rebellion, which I'm not going to go into much detail about, but you'd had a rebellion of northern Mexican states between 1838 and 1840. So the folks in Laredo, they didn't have very warm feelings towards Mexico City. They thought Mexico City ignored them, was only taxing them, wasn't protecting them from Indian raids. So it wasn't like they were in love with Mexico City. And there were advantages to being part of Texas. It was much... their land claims are recognized. The Benavides family, Santos's uncle, Basilio, and I'm not going to test you on him, so don't worry about that. He actually serves in the Texas legislature in the 1850s. And so the Benavides family is actually quite comfortable in Texas. They keep their land, they keep their status. They're okay with slavery. They don't really care about slavery. Santos actually went into Mexico and would capture and return runaway slaves to their slave owners in the U.S. It's a little unclear if he did this for money, because there was a big bounty on runaway slaves, or if he did this just because he thought it was the right thing to do. So Santos Benavides, unlike Cortina, embraces Texas and actually embraces the U.S. South as well. Now, he's not growing cotton because there's not enough water there. But Santos Benavides turns out to be quite happy surprisingly, after 1848, and he was probably surprised himself,